Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SB Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Gemini Moon, as the Sect Light, I speak with the astrologer Suprasensory Shahir. We talked about the placement of their moon in the 7th whole sign house and how that manifests as an abundance of close one-to-one relationships for Shahir. We also talked about the importance of the nodes and nodal transits. We talked a bit about the moon's role in Islam and mystical strains of Islam like Sufism, the myth of Persephone as it relates to Hecate and the moon, the divine protection that can come with worldly rejection, and my continued struggle with that. Shahir and I talked about the myth of Castor and Pollux as it relates to the sign of Gemini, as well as Gemini's mutable air nature, which is often very social and intellectual. We talk about the common versatile nature of Mercury and how that relates to temperament. Shahir and I also discuss common tarot correspondences with the decans of Gemini, as well as the lunar mansions that fall in Gemini. In addition, we talked about Shahir's Mercury in Pisces and all of the amazing divinatory occult skill that comes along with that, in addition to some of the challenges that Mercury has in a Jupiterian sign. As always, if you enjoy the work I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services by going to the services page. I'm offering natal and horary consultations in addition to a timing consult that I recently launched. So if you're looking to get a year ahead reading or look at a year in the past, the year that you just had or sometime further in the past, I would love to work with you there. In addition, you can also book a natal and timing consultation at the same time for a little bit of a discount. So please go to my website for more information on that. In addition as well, I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing services. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Shahir. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to their website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Shahir, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, very early in the morning in Malaysia, but I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to have you. How's the astrology been treating you as of late? Any transits that have been giving you trouble or bringing you great
Yeah,
joy?
I think, I don't know, I'm very much in my notes activation, I guess. It's like I do feel my life. Like I recently I recently wrote how notes have power to like flip the script of your storytelling. And I think I
Mm,
really feel that, especially with recent eclipses, because I literally came back home from to Malaysia from New York. I mean, I just graduated, and then it's like it's something against my will, quote unquote, right? But then obviously I was the one deciding ultimately, but like I also had like other plans initially. And so
mm,
that's like that has been quite literal for me in terms of like the nodal activation and how my life just like reconfigured and just like I just came back home kind of thing. Yeah.
mm. Well, congratulations on graduating with your master's degree, correct?
Hmm.
Yeah, that's huge. That's amazing. It was your plan to stay in New York?
Yes, I was initially trying to find jobs in New York and then it just didn't work out the way I would want to. But then now that I'm here, I was like, actually, there's a lot of things I need to settle when I'm home. So it's like, it's kind of revealing in some ways too. Yeah. I was like, I
Mm,
feel very much, what's the word? In my own rhythm. And I feel very good here just because I just feel like I'm at the right place where I'm meant to be rather than I'm
mm,
trying to resist something that was kind of like it almost become a fixation. And I know whenever I'm like fixated on something, I'm like, all right, there's a healthy amount of fixation and there's like a spiritually and kind of like toxic mental health, etc., wise. So I think if it comes to like fixating on some things. Yeah.
mm.
Which I'm a mutable sign. So usually I'm like, oh my God, something is wrong with me whenever I'm like, I'm too fixated on this.
Yeah, yeah. So we are doing the Gemini Moon as Sect Light episode right now, but you're also, and we'll get into this a little bit later, we know each other from ascendant assemblies because we're both
Mm-hmm.
mutable risings, we're both Sag risings. And so you have kind of quite a bit of mutability in your chart. Yeah, I like what you talked about in terms of like fixation, and there's a certain amount that's healthy, and then there's a certain amount that is a little bit excessive, and it's kind of like there's a happy medium there.
Mm-hmm.
I think before we kind of move on a little bit, I'm just curious. And it's funny, we were talking right before where you were just kind of like, you just kind of go with the flow, right? With questions. And we're already like going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious
The wind
where,
like blew. Oh my
yeah, yeah.
God.
I'm curious where your nodes are and how you look at the nodes, given what you said about them coming into play now.
Yeah, I mean, I have K2 in Gemini, which is the south node as well. And so I have like
Mm,
Rahu in or north node in Sagittarius. So by like tropical system. So yeah, so I am also in the Gemini perfected year. So it's like it's kind of funny how everything just lines up astrologically. And
mm,
and so I'm back home, which is like kind of makes sense because I'm also like the Gemini moon becomes in-house activation, the
mm-hmm,
perfected ascendant. So yeah. Yeah, that's where
mm.
my node is. Yeah. And K2 is like for me, South Node has also the energy of releasing, which I think I also want to talk about how like there is the nodes are important in terms of like the Gemini and Sag axis too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think in some traditions, if I'm not mistaken, the North Node, isn't there some type of like exaltation of the node
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Sag?
In Gemini.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in Gemini slash Taurus. It depends on like which scholarship you see. But yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's the South Node having
And
like
then the South
dignity.
Node. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
No, mine is kind of flipped, I guess, because it's like it's supposed to be Gemini. North Node has more dignity than a Gemini South Node.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I feel like some people look at the South Node as like a place of lack almost, because
Mm-hmm.
that's like if we think of the tail of the dragon and we think of like the head kind of eats is consuming and the
Mm-hmm.
tail is expelling. And so you can think of the South Node as a place of like where, I don't know, some people say like in past lives, like your South Node
Mm-hmm.
is leading from the past life or whatever. I'm not really like an evolutionary astrologer, or I don't know, I don't really
Mm-hmm.
think in these kinds of terms, but I'm just trying to get more familiarity with the nodes and just think about them, because I think I have my nodes in my north node in Aquarius in the third house and my south node
Mm-hmm.
in Leo in the ninth house. And I think very much that like as like for many Sag risings, I think like we're low key like super solar with like that ninth house Leo, the house
Mm-hmm.
where the sun joys. Like I think that a lot of my life revolves around nice ninth house themes. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just curious for you, like, do you feel like seventh house themes really come up for you in your life with the south node
Yeah.
there?
I think it definitely is. I think I have, for one, I think I'm one of those people who have really a lot of friends, and I really have lots of like close friends, which I really bond with one on one, and I think
Mm,
I do that a lot. Obviously having a client work also feels very easy for me, and yeah, I like collaborating with another person, and like I mean, obviously like a Jupiter in Libra chart ruler too, but I think the seventh house is like whenever I deal with another person, I always find joy in it, and it's very easy for me usually. And I think South Node almost represents that sense of familiarity as well, but it can
mm,
also be a point of recently I was thinking about the South Node as like an empty cup, kind of feeling, especially with the recent eclipse. It's like,
mm,
yeah, like the South Node is always trying to clear out whatever that was in that house, because you're supposed to like go towards your North Node, because it's like for me the notes are always something you're trying to balance. You're not trying to
mm,
do the one side too much as well, because that can tip the balance. So it's like for me it's like yeah, it's always like the notes are always the things that are always perfect in balance.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I think that I really like that word for the nodal axis, like a
Hmm.
balance point or like a place in your life where you kind of want more of that balance between those house significations. That's really interesting to
Yeah.
think about.
Yeah. I mean, like the fact that you're doing this podcast seems very like third house north node too, right? Um, yeah,
Yeah, and it's very interesting because you have is your MC in Virgo or in Libra?
Virgo.
Okay, cool. Because my MC is
Yeah.
in Libra and I have Venus in the third. So there's like these kinds
Mm,
of Venus in the third significations that go into like my MC and my career and stuff like that. And
yeah.
yeah, so it is very fitting in ways. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that and going on that first little tangent with me. We'll see how many us mutable people, see how many
You
tangents we
slash
get off
yeah,
on.
that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, Shahir, can you give us like a brief introduction to yourself, your practice,
Oh yeah.
influences and teachers you've had?
So I call myself a love devotee. I've been um, associating that term even more strongly these days. Um, because for me, like, I love having love as an anchor whenever I
Mm,
talk about divinity or my practice, I guess. I'm obviously a tarot reader, I'm astrologer, I'm a spirit guide connector as well. Those are kind of like three of my specialties in terms of like the esoteric work. Um, but I always call myself a lover of life, and that's why one of the many things why I consider myself a love devotee. Um,
mm,
in terms of like how I learn and my teachers, obviously I had like Sabrina Monarch as one of my evolutionary astrology teacher. I actually learned from
amazing.
Kelsey as well.
Oh, cool.
When Kelsey was having lots of the beginners and intermediate courses early on. Um, Kelsey Rose Tort, if anyone's curious out there. But I honestly, in a very much Gemini moon fashion, I learned a lot of my astrology through like books and um, listening to podcasts. And I think a lot of Gemini moon astrologers out there must have listened to their podcasts on three times the speed or something like that.
Are you a 2x, 3x podcast listener?
Yes, 2x. If anything, I
Amazing.
would be unhappy because not unhappy. Sometimes I feel like YouTube doesn't have the 3x, only Spotify has them. And so I was like, when Spotify made the three times speed, I was like, but yeah.
That is
Um,
feels so amazingly mercurial. I cannot imagine listening on anything but 1x. I feel like I don't know if it's like because I'm in my 30s, I feel like I'm an old person or something. It's like
mhm.
I hear the kids talking about like yeah, listening to podcasts like double speed. I'm just like
Yeah,
how do you absorb it? I don't know.
it's a lot. It's like I sometimes I also that's also the thing. I think it's like sometimes I don't absorb everything, obviously. It's just for me to like, okay, let me just run through it and just pick what feels like interesting for me. Yeah, it's very speedy in that way. Yeah.
Very cool. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Beautiful. I love the emphasis on love and it does feel very I feel like the relational houses in your chart are
Mm-hmm.
they're just jumping out as very loud to me. You said your ascendant ruler is in Libra in the 11th. I know you have Saturn in Aquarius in the third, your moon. And so there's this like beautiful kind of grand trine going on
Mm-hmm.
between those three planets. And yeah, it feels very cool. Yeah, I just love that as an emphasis. Love and devotion to love, love of life.
Yeah, yeah, and I love it too, and I think it was like I found it true. Apparently, when I started identifying with it, it was also a time where I had like the Lord of the Turn and the Soul Turn, and I was like, oh wow, no wonder that was like literally the year where I was publicly more identifying with that sort of role. Um, and so that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean Jupiter in Libra is like Libra is a Venusian thing, so it's like if you just use that to delineate, it's already like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. And I just wanted to speak briefly about how we know each other and kind of express some
Mm-hmm.
gratitude for you for kind of making this being like a catalyst for this podcast to even happen because yeah we met I believe we met in Ascended Assemblies, maybe we met before that, but I've kind of gotten to know you a little bit through
Mm-hmm.
Ascended Assemblies, which is where we know Kelsey and we know a bunch of other wonderful Sag risings as well. It's kind of, for those that
Yeah.
don't know, it's like it's a meetup for your rising sign. And so there's like we're both Sag risings and there's a wonderful group of people who come we just talk about transits and what job we quit, because that seems to be a satirizing thing. Apparently,
I
someone's
know.
always quitting a job. But when I was thinking about launching this podcast, was right around the time that you launched your Venus embodiment series on YouTube. And
Mm-hmm.
I was so inspired by you doing it, because I'm kind of like, this is kind of like a moon embodiment series,
Mm-hmm.
really. And,
Yeah.
it's cool. Mackenzie is part of us, our Sag Rising group, Ascended Assemblies as well. And she's now doing a Mars embodiment series that you were on. You were on the inaugural episode of that. And so it's like we're all doing this kind of like embodiment work. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah, and so you kind of like, I saw you doing that and I was like, oh fuck, I think I'm gonna do this now. And so
that's
you kind of
true.
inspired me to launch this podcast. And I was, really grateful for that. And I think it's just a testament to how important gonna get emotional like starting to talk about it, but I feel like it's a testament for how important community is, and how
Mm-hmm.
like inspiring um and important it is for us to like do our work and shine in the
Mm-hmm.
world, so that other people can like see that and
Mm-hmm.
respond to it in a way where they can be like, oh, that person's doing it, like I can do my thing, kind of.
Yeah. No, oh no, like all praises to you. Like you step on, what you're meant to be doing. And yeah, obviously, and I love that. And I think one thing that comes up for me is like I remember when I was growing up, I was always like, I loved the idea of like, you need to, get inspiration and also like be the inspiration as well. And there's always this like, that's like what you call like a flowy process, like the lemniscate or like the infinity sign to it, right?
Mm,
And I think being community really helps, for sure, because it's like, yeah. And I think then I was like, me, and like that's why I believe like why Jupiter is rejoicing in the 11th house, because like without community you can't really achieve your dreams, and like
mm.
that's like a simple fact in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like we're not competing with each other. We're like doing
Mm-hmm.
our things in the world that are helping other people, helping propel other people to do their thing in the world. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
we can cooperate and we can collaborate and also be supportive of each other,
Yeah.
um, without having there be a competitive element that comes in, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, that's true. Although I'm in Aries, it's just like, oh my God. But then yeah,
Yeah, I don't know why I have our
yeah.
the ruler of our fifth in the first. So I kind of
Uh
embody some of that competitive stuff too. But it's mostly like, I just started skateboarding again recently around the eclipse, which was in our fifth house, which is like funny, like start skateboarding again, which I did as a
oh
kid,
wow.
as a result of that. And that's kind of like competing with myself. Sometimes I can be very competitive if I'm playing like board games or something, or like a team
Mm-hmm.
sport.
Oh my
But
God.
yeah.
Yeah, board games. I'm such a competitive board game person. My friends
Yeah,
would be scared, but they also would laugh a lot. I mean, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. All right. So to start talking a little bit about your moon, I'm just curious,
Mhm.
when you think back to childhood, what was your relationship with the moon at that time? Or what's one memory that comes to mind in relation to the moon? Like, what was your relationship to this being, this body, before you
Mm,
became the kind of like diviner astrologer,
yeah,
that you are today?
yeah. It's kind of interesting because I was such an Aries in the sense of like even before because remember, like sometimes when you grow up, people say like you're more like a lunar child, whatever. I've never felt like I was a lunar child. I
Mm,
was such a like Solarian in a lot of ways, and I think that
mm,
energy feels very easy for me. Um, but when I think about the moon, I recently also just because I got back home, and this is like a story since child that I was always aware of, just because um is actually in my name as well because technically the name Shahir, um, it comes from the Arabic root word, which can go both ways. On one of it is actually like Shahr, which is Shahr is actually month, in the Islamic calendar,
mm,
and so I was always aware of that. I was also like a an Arabic student, and I think my parents told me that as well, just because like I love knowing what my name was, like how my
Mm.
name became to be in a way. And so I was born during the month of Shawwal, which is for Muslims around the world, it is the month of celebration, just because we just had 1 month long of Ramadan, which is where we're fasting and then we're celebrating. And that's kind
Mm.
of like the sequence. And so I was born on the fifth night, the fifth eve, yeah, so basically the fourth day and the fifth eve night of Shawwal. And yeah, that was also how I kind of know I almost named Shawwal just because my parents wanted to keep the like SH amongst our at least yeah, my brothers and even my little brothers. So yeah, that was how I was aware of like, oh, my moon, my name has some lunar significance because I mean in Arabic, the moon is actually al-qamar, which is usually when you refer to the moon. Um, there are different names for it whenever it's like different phases as well. But
Mm.
Shahar, which Shahru Ramadan or Shahru Shawwal, is like is the month off kind of thing. So it's like that's how the month is usually like when you put a perimeter and becomes a different word. And so actually, yeah, my name has that sort of like linguistic element that is related to the moon in a lot of ways. So
Mm.
which really makes a lot of sense. Like having the moon as my sect light. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I I know a little bit. I don't know much about Islam, but I know uh, Tony of the Woods came on and he talked a little bit about his practice in that religion, and it seems like the moon has a really prominent place.
Mm-hmm.
And I was commenting on that episode how like a lot of majority Islamic countries have the moon on their flag, and how
Mm-hmm.
I thought that that was an interesting commonality.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that your name has these lunar connotations within,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you grew up Muslim, but within the kind
Yeah.
of a cultural connotation where the
Yeah.
moon has like exaltation or prominence.
Yeah, yeah, I know that's so true. And obviously, yeah, I am Muslim. I do identify as like a queer Muslim mystique. Um, and
Awesome.
so very much in line with like the Sufi tradition
Mm-hmm.
more lately. That's how I embrace it. But yeah, the lunar connotation is very strong and like that's how you track the month. And usually the months are in Islam. That's why every year you kind of like celebrate Ramadan and Shawwal. It moves, right? Because we use the
Right.
lunar calendar rather than the solar calendar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And just to be clear, because I'm curious, the Sufi tradition is that's kind of like a mystical tradition within Islam,
Yeah,
right?
it
And
is
I know
with Islam.
Rumi was like a Sufi, and there's this kind of
Yeah.
poetic creativity associated with it as well.
Yeah, like definitely Rumi, Attar. Um, some people even contest that Sufi is not from Islam. So that's like also whenever like a spiritual concept has become so universalized that like the origin somehow is like blurred. But then
Mm,
for me, I would definitely say it branches out from there at least.
okay.
Although some people might, like some Sufis might even say that's wrong, you know. So that's how flexible it is, which is great. Like it's not trying to confine that sort of it's also like another way of life in some ways. Yeah.
Mm, very cool. Yeah, so what does the moon mean to you today, and why do you think it's important that we focus on the moon when we talk about astrology or practice astrology?
Yeah, I love that because I think for me the moon is always like the I do see the moon as the divine mother or the divine caretaker in a lot of ways, right?
Mm,
um I see it more of as like the cup kind of feeling, like, you know, it's like there's this sense of like, oh, like what holds you in this world,
mm,
right? And I think that's the moon. The moon kind of like holds you in this world. And um you know, even the idea of like, you know, people like come from the womb and stuff like that. But I think it's more about like what is the container that you're being held in. And I think I love relating to the moon that way because that can um go towards like this like a very generative idea of like all right, this is something I'm creating in a lot of ways. And so for me, I always see the moon in that sort of like lens, what holds you in a lot of ways, which can be your emotions, your mind, your, whatever chaos that exists in this
Mm,
world, and how you kind of like be about from there, right? And so yeah, it's like for me, like the moon is almost like a way of a being, um and feeling and thinking. It almost very like for me, the moon is very inclusive sort of planet, in a lot of
mm,
ways. Yeah. Mm.
Can you touch on that a little bit more? Like, what do you think? Where do you think that inclusivity comes from?
Yeah, I think for me it's like the idea that the moon goes around, right? Is like
Mm-hmm.
every month is like the fastest planet, and I think um it is always translating and the like between like going to here and there. It's like you're almost saying something to different planets, and by transit wise when I'm looking at it, um and it's also like a process in which I think it's trying to like piece it all together. It's like trying to like for me, I sometimes see the moon as like every month the moon is like going around to hold the all the planets together in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, and so I like to because I do associate the moon with a certain kind of quote unquote manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, obviously in terms of like the pagan and like a lot of like spiritual work do work with the moon directly in terms of like trying to manifest something in
Yeah.
the next lunation cycle, in the next 2 weeks, or in the next 6 months or something like that, right? It's always that sort of process. But then for me, it's always like whenever I go to every month, which is kind of funny because my name literally has connotation to the month.
Mm.
And so I always, because I see it as like the moon trying to like pick up this sort of like different stories, but also translating different stories and also moving around, but also like putting it all together. It's like a string, like it's like you're like a string, and then you're moving through the beats of like the different planets. So if it's like if you have a
Mm.
bracelet, right, it's like each planet can be representing different gems. Um,
Mm.
and so the moon just goes around and trying to like beat them all together, like, like thread them all together. And then
Yeah.
like there's always the rethreading that goes on and on and on. And then that's like the moon cycle.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that. That's such a beautiful image of that moon cycle, and like how in a typical month the moon can interact with different planets and like carry messages between different planets. I don't know if you had this in the kind of like school culture where you were growing up, but I was just thinking
Mm-hmm.
about the moon when you were talking as like the person who passes notes between
Mm.
people, like if you have someone who has like a crush on you and you want to, like, will you go out with me, yes, no, maybe, like,
Yeah.
and you'll get your friend to like bring bring the
Yeah.
note to the person you have a crush on. And
It's
I feel like the
true.
moon is kind of that way, in the sense of
Yeah.
like, if Saturn and yeah, like Saturn and Jupiter or something, whatever, can be technically like averse to each other, so they can't see each other. But the
Mm-hmm.
moon, because of the way it moves, could potentially take the light of Saturn and move it to Jupiter and kind of create this communication that wouldn't
Yeah.
otherwise be there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love that imagery so much, um and that's very noble in a lot of ways too, because it's like it kind of like for me it's like it's that's why I think the moon and Mercury is always like intertwined in a lot of ways as like the
Yeah.
translator or the messenger planet, which make lots of sense. But for me, it's like for me, Mercury is more in service to the sun,
Mm,
just because of like, yeah, Mercury is the translator of the sun for me in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously it's also the translator of the cosmos, but then the sun becomes the main authority to Mercury. But then the
right.
moon has no authority. Like the moon is almost like a neutral thing. um it's like this, that's why people also call it like the mediatrix, like the mediator. The moon is the
Right.
mediator, because I think to be a mediator, you also need to come from a point of like neutrality in some ways, right? If you were to be the one passing the love note to another person, you cannot be, I mean, obviously you can have feelings and you're like, all right, which side am I on, blah, blah, blah. But like,
Right.
you have to honor the job in a way, in the sense like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be that one. You can't be the one taking the notes away, or like you can't have like in a way you
Right.
need to like evaluate. Yeah.
You can't have a crush on the person too and be like, I'm not going to deliver the note because I have a crush on them too. And yeah, you have to have like
Yeah,
some loyalty and trust with your
that's true.
friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I'm going to tell like a little story and I'm probably going to get emotional because I get emotional when I talk about Hecate. Do you have a relationship with Hecate at all?
I used to, but like for me, it's just now very much in the background. But yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so I was doing the earth signs class with Jason Holly and we started talking about Virgo and
Mm-hmm.
we talked about the myth of Persephone and had
Mm-hmm.
this focus on Ceres, the asteroid. But I was very much, I think that Hecate can sometimes get associations with the moon. And
Mm-hmm.
in that story uh, of Persephone, you have both Hecate and you have Hermes,
Mm-hmm.
who are playing these kind of psychopomp roles. And I love Mercury, but in this
Mm-hmm.
story, Mercury is not really a messenger of the sun, but a messenger of their father Zeus. So
Mm-hmm.
is going into the underworld to kind of treat with Hades on
Mm-hmm.
behalf of Zeus to be like, listen, nothing's growing. We need to like figure out something so that because what happens is Demeter, Persephone's mother, is basically just like, I'm not going to let anything grow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to make all of you pay for the fact that you let this happen to my daughter.
Yeah.
And Mercury's just kind of like, my dad sent me. I'm trying to figure
Mm-hmm.
this out. But Hecate is the one that she doesn't see Hades take Persephone into the underworld, but she hears it happen. And when
Mm-hmm.
Demeter comes, Hecate is the one that meets Demeter and kind of comforts this grieving mother.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the part that gets emotional for me because Hecate makes the choice to be the psychopomp. She's not really
Mm-hmm.
like forced as part of her role. She's
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm going to go with you,
Mm-hmm.
Persephone, into the underworld because
Mm-hmm.
you need like someone to be with you and comfort you and be with you on that journey.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think it's really beautiful. And
I
really
think that,
like touching for me
yeah.
personally.
Yeah,
Uh
and I think it's like the moon becomes like almost like a natural companion. And I think it's like, and also it makes me think about like the cardinal part of the moon. And wow, thank you for sharing that story.
yeah,
Um,
thank
and
you
yeah,
for
that
hearing it.
yeah, that I think that's very personal, and a lot, and I think that's where the moon is, right? It's like, all right, I'm also just gonna be doing it, right? And that's why I do think why the energy of like the mother or the caretaker always has that kind of like element, the guardian, right? Because they feel responsible for the world they live in, like the sense of like this is actually within, again, like the within the scope of like the world that I am in, and then hence I can be doing like something about it, and so I will be that person. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah, absolutely. And it just makes me think about I'm sure that there's a lot more to this than just the moon, than just Cancer being on the ascendant in the Thema Mundi, but
Mm-hmm.
it just reminds me of like um, Cancer. Well, I believe it's actually because the star Sirius is associated with Cancer,
Mm-hmm.
and in Egypt, Sirius was associated with the flooding of the Nile, and so they
Yeah.
kind of like created this idea of the Thema Mundi, the birth of the world, this chart,
Yeah.
um, which all these amazing kind of teaching tools within it, like
Mm-hmm.
exaltation structure and the domicile structure and all this stuff. But
Yeah.
Cancer is on the ascendant, and that's the domicile of the moon. And there feels something um like needing that kind of protection from the moon, needing
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like maybe hard exterior or container as you talked
Mm-hmm.
about, so that like kind of like the soft insides can form and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, progress or move into another form,
Yeah.
have that kind of nurturing to develop.
Yeah, no, I think that is very true. And the fact that, I mean, I can definitely say from real life experience, even right now, I I am where I'm recording from. I'm actually at my one of my besties' sites, extra room in his place, and I think that's very lunar in a lot of ways because I came home to Malaysia and I was like, my life is in shambles. Not to say my life is in shambles. I was like,
Mm,
I think because Syed knows that I do this creative work on the side, and it's kind of like a given that I don't really have a personal space back at my own home, just because I have a lot of people in my family.
mm,
Um, and so I never would have like a lot of like, oh, just like a container for me to like try from. And then I think it's like the fact that I like one of my like best friends that we used to be housemates and stuff like that. And so I just moved in into his new place, which is like a new setup. And so I'm basically officiating like the guest room bed in a way. Um, and so he was like, all right, yeah, just you can come to my place whenever you need to record stuff, blah, blah, blah. And I think that also shows like the lunar quality of my bestie and like
mm-hmm,
the very Gemini moon sort of like manifestation for me because this week is actually when I have it's so funny. I was like the synchronicity this week is bizarre because earlier this week I was expecting a okay, this is how I'm like astrologizing the moment, but I think it is
mm,
very relevant how sometimes we think it's like the universe almost has a way to like take care of you. And I think that's very
mm,
lunar in a lot of ways. Like I was expecting an immigration lottery decision earlier this week with the eclipse, and then that didn't materialize.
mm,
And that was something I was holding on to, right? I was like, oh my God, like I elected this, I consulted with different tarot readers and astrologer to get like the perfect timing. Um,
mm-hmm,
because it's a lottery, right? So it's like I'll take
right.
all my chances. Um, but then it didn't work out. And then I was like, oh, I thought that the decision was supposed to be one of the delineation of like what happens when the perfected ascendant comes to the moon, right? It's like, ooh, it's like maybe when the perfected ascendant comes to the double-bodied moon, you be granted I mean, this is just me imagining I'm an ancient astrologer, like you'll be
Uh-huh.
granted another citizenship or PR, permanent resident elsewhere, because the moon is also like the home and the location in a lot of ways. But then that didn't happen. And I was like, obviously, I was like, oh shit. Like in some ways, I was like mind fucked a bit, right? Um, but then I think suddenly this exact week too, I was like, I have a podcast to record. And I've always known this. I mean, Said has always mentioned this to me. I was like, all right, whenever you want, you can come. And I'm like, all right, now I'm responding to that like invitation. And I was like, all right,
Mm,
let me actually take on that. And then actually I was here last night too. I mean the night before this, um, I was actually with Said and Maha, and then even Maha, one of my best friends, so it's like the three of us together, also was like, oh, Shahir, if you need a place to crash or even do your thing when Said's space is not available, you can come to my place. And so I was like, and I think it's like I was also like I was riding on my car last night, just like going home and I was just like tearing out in my car because
mm,
and like I think that's like example of the moon is like you don't have to be doing it, but you just do it, right? And I
mm,
think, yeah, and like taking care of the people around you is like a lunar moon experience. And although that's like you don't have necessarily direct responsibility of it, right? Um, but you just want to help, and I think that's like one of the beauty of the moon.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I really do hope that you hear some positive news soon. Um, because I know how big of a deal that is, and
Yeah.
like having I've lived abroad a few times, and one time I was kind of trying to stay and then I ended up not staying in that country, but
Mm-hmm.
I know how difficult it can be for to deal with that kind of process,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the US. I hear that it's not they don't make it easy. So I do hope that
Yeah.
you hear good news soon.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that's interesting that comes up just about the nature of astrology is that at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about expecting a certain thing, staying in New York, and then moving back home and
Mm-hmm.
having this kind of experience that you kind of needed to have. And it's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting to, again, like I'm always just fascinated by with like the fate and free will of
Yeah.
things, and like how much we can choose with electional astrology, how much we can
Yeah.
change, and then like what things are actually good for us to change, and
Mm-hmm.
like when is it good for us to allow our fate to unfold
Mm-hmm.
as it
Yeah.
may, because maybe we'll get better things than we could have chosen or that we thought.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard. I don't have answers to those questions. I don't have all of that wisdom, but
Yeah. No,
it's
I
really
agree.
interesting.
Yeah. And lately I've been also thinking it's like I do see, because I do consider myself a mystic who believes in the co-creation. She's also like creation is also such a lunar thing.
Mm,
I I don't really care about that fate and free will, in the sense of like I care about being attuned to the like cosmic rhythm almost, right? And so I was like,
mm,
and so when this happened, I was like sad. I was like that the ego, like, and like, I don't want to like codify it so much, but like there's always a part of me that just like, oh shit, like, and I think I recently tweeted, because I think we just had the eclipse in the 12th house. I think
mm-hmm,
in a lot of ways, I think my past self would have been so hurt by this result. Like that was like, okay, obviously I could try again. This is not like the end all be all. There's always multiple pathways. I'm still gonna apply for jobs abroad and stuff like that. So it's like obviously
mm-hmm,
it's not the end all be all. But then at the same time, I was also like really tuning into that sort of like energy of like, all right, guy, I think I'm like being back and being in, and as you were saying too, of like something better, and I feel it. And I was like, all right, this is like me being attuned to like my own cosmic rhythm. It's not fated for me to pursue one thing or like to really go towards that path. And there's also another path. Um,
mm,
and so I think it's like, yeah, it's it's so hard sometimes as our human selves too, right? It's just like, and I was thinking about like how my past self would have been so depressed for sure. I would have been like reckoning with like the universe or God. I was just like, how dare you spiritually, like you abandon your, and going into that sort of like almost like a victim mindset, but also like you were like probably like my past self would have been deeply hurt in a lot of ways.
mm,
Um,
yeah,
and but now I was just like, oh wow. And I was like, and I actually thanked it. And I think I was like, all right, thank you for showing me a different path for now. And
mm,
so yeah, yeah, it's hard. It's a hard work. It's like a lifelong
yeah.
work for sure.
It's beautiful and inspiring though for me too, because sometimes like I feel like I do this less than I used to, but sometimes I still have to have like a good yell at God,
Yeah,
like where I'm
no,
just
for
like,
real.
I fucking wanted this, and like I don't like, this is what, like I feel abandoned, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I feel like I needed you to come through and
Mm-hmm.
you're not coming through, or you didn't, and I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how to always, I'm still trying to figure out how to toe the line of like, okay, it's not my time, or that wasn't meant for me. But I have this thing where it's like, I'm just kind of this way in life too. It's like if I make plans, I want to do the plans. If I
Mm-hmm.
don't make plans, I don't care.
I
You know what I mean? But
see.
if I'm like, God, please help
Your
me.
earth
Like, please help me
sign.
do this thing. Yeah, I'm an earth sign. Yeah, that my cap stellium is like, we're making plans or we're not, but like if we're making
Yeah.
plans, we're doing it. And
Yeah.
and sometimes like, yeah, I just get really propelled in that one direction with that cap stellium. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, if it doesn't happen, I'm like, what the fuck? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, agreed. But like, yeah, it's definitely one of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's move on to talking about the sign of Gemini and what
Mm-hmm.
it means for you. And I'd also love to hear if you have any considerations of myth play into your understanding of that
Mm.
sign or your experience of your moon.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I do love the sign of Gemini as being the twin kind of thing, just because it falls nicely with my chart. Because one of my first loves was also someone with a twin. That was kind of funny. I was just like, this is the astrologer great of it all. Um, but yeah, signs of Gemini. Gemini is um an air sign. Mutable airs is like a soft breeze or chaotic. It can be. It's like for me, it's like Gemini is always like that sort of energy that can go like it can be a soft breeze, but it can also be soft breeze, but it can also be a chaotic breeze, right? And I was thinking a lot about like through like the Castor and Pollux myth and like how they are both like the patron sailors of like controlling the wind. So it's like
Mm,
I love that sort of like imagery so much because it can make me think about I can look at my mutable angles even more like beautifully. It's like if like the ship is Sagittarius, and then the sailors are actually um Gemini, right? The custodian um
mm,
of the ship in some ways. And so there's always this interaction going on between like the ship and the crewsmen and like the sailors. And so the idea of like being the patron of the winds does make sense because it's like you need the wind for a ship to move to go on a voyage, right?
mm,
As much as you need information to go to move forward as well to like explore a different horizon. And so I love that sort of like the axis play um a Gemini and Sag sort of thing. Um, and so that's one thing, and like, for in a kind of like traditional kind of way. And for me, Gemini is also about connecting and collecting in a lot of ways, right? Mercury rules both Virgo and Gemini. Um, m- Although in Virgo it has more exaltation, it has domicile and exaltation. But for me, Gemini has that sense of, um, and that's why I love incorporating the North Node dignity in Gemini in some ways, because I do feel that is where like the hunger for more information before the Virgo process could be done, right? It's like if there's no Gemini, there can't be a good Virgo. Like the Virgo wouldn't happen without the Gemini, you know?
So I will say, just for the episode's sake, that we're actually now recording on a different day because we were recording a few days ago and we started talking about the sign of Gemini and I lost power. And so and Mercury retrograde struck. I don't know, Uranus struck. I'm not quite sure exactly what happened, but it's now a few days later, so we're returning to record this for a second time, which is funny with the Gemini Moon and Gemini's association with the twins. But Shahir will get more into what the sign of Gemini means for them now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's kind of very Geminian in a way, and it's kind of bizarre too, goodness, like because Gemini is also about like the sign that is about like the doubling effect, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we had to have a double recording almost that feels very on brand, sort of like Gemini energy in a lot of ways. Like whenever I think of like Gemini energy, it's always like what like the multiplication or like a duplication. So it's like it's almost like, yeah, all right, I have to redo this, or like I mean obviously that's like a Mercury retrograde kind of thing as well. But like, yeah, things comes in dual whenever you deal with Gemini. And it's kind of interesting because you also like even in your podcast, you're also like interviewing people based on whether the moon is either in their insect or is out of sec. So that's very on brand for you to be like doing this sort of like dual thing.
Mm,
Um for me, it's like Gemini, I always come back to it as being a mutable air. Like it is for me, it is a like I love coming back to Mercury in a Gemini energy. It's like I think about Mercury as the psychopomp, right?
mm,
Um and I do believe that Mercury is kind of like the OG messenger in a lot of ways. Just because Mercury has kind of like this weird access to all realms, right? And
mm,
so and I that's why I kind of I've always loved the idea that like Mercury is exalted in Virgo and their own sign, right?
mm,
Um and I mean even in traditional astrology, like Mercury is always like the signification of Mercury is always like related to whatever it is with. And so that I think there is and that is also where I think the signification of like Gemini comes from is like whatever it's with, it kind of like mirrors that, or it duplicates that same energy, and it's trying to like inquire something as well. And so for me, like, and through that like sort of lens of like being the psychopomp, it's, you have access to a lot of things, and you're meant to kind of like connect those things as well. And I think that seems
Mm.
very Geminian in a lot of way, especially with the moon in Gemini. It's like the moon is like the nourisher, and like you're trying to connect things that nourish you in some ways, right?
Mm.
And so it kind of like creates this sort of like, all right, how do I connect this idea with that idea, with that idea? And it is kind of like sometimes Gemini would play the angel, meaning that like they will agree with you. But then sometimes Gemini would also play the devil, and they would be like
Mm-hmm.
being the opposite, giving you the alternative point of view, right?
Mm.
And so I love seeing Gemini through that sort of like the psychopomp of options in some ways as well. And that's why Mercury is kind of like the friend, but also the trickster, right? It has this dual quality. Like for me, Mercury is interesting because by being the messenger planet, it is almost like, for me, like it for me, the story of Mercury seems very much like Mercury is very much interested in humanity in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because like you're the one bearing the news, and you kind of like have to be one with the human beings, quote unquote, if you believe in such structure of divinity. And it's kind of like the angels, right? Like the angels or whatever messengers that you believe in, kind of like have to know the language of the human world. Uh, in some ways, right? Like you have to know the language of the things you're inquiring about. But then by then you also end up, on one hand, you can also feel a bit confused in some ways, but also you are kind of like playing this sort of like inquiry things with the other, or with the human, or
Right.
with the opposite. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
With Gemini, I would think there's like, with the associations with social, so kind of interpersonal relationships, but also intellectual. There's this kind of like perhaps nourishment through engaging others through ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that is something I enjoy doing, even like effortlessly sometimes. Of like,
Mm.
I was just talking to my friend on and on yesterday, and I was like, yeah, like that's a very mercurial trait too. Like you can just talk and talk and talk, and it's almost like it's annoying sometimes, because it's like, all right, like I think we need to stop. But yeah,
Mm. Mm.
because you can just like always talk and go off tangents. And yeah, I think it's like there's always like information is always so vast, right? And it's like it's never enough in some ways. And I think, yeah, I think Gemini has that sort of like the desire to know more, which can create a problem in some way as well, because they might feel like, oh, there's not enough
Mm.
information yet, or whatever, although they have probably gathered so much already.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I want to quickly just like break down a few of the concepts that you put
Mm-hmm.
out there. I feel like
Okay.
we talked a little bit about the psychopomp when I kind of talked
Uh-huh.
about that story about Hecate
Uh-huh.
and Persephone and whatnot. So I feel like that's kind of like a concept we've covered already, but basically the psychopomp is like the one that descends into the underworld, can be a guide in that place. And I'm not sure if when the Olympians like Zeus and Poseidon and Hades, when they kind of like take over things from the
Mm-hmm.
Titans,
Mm-hmm.
they divide basically the world, with Zeus taking the sky and Poseidon taking the sea and Hades taking the
Mm-hmm.
underworld. And I think that there's something about like not all of the gods can like go into the underworld
Yeah.
and then come back out, but there are certain gods that can kind of descend and are able
And
to
go
come
out.
out. Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
Mercury is one of them. And I feel like astrologically we kind of think about that as like the retrograde cycle, or the
Mm-hmm.
particular synodic cycle of Mercury, because Mercury is so
Yeah.
attached to the sun, and then goes retrograde and kind of goes under the beams,
Mm-hmm.
and these kinds of things, goes out of visibility when it's under the beams. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And I think the thing that you brought up with Mercury, I just want to emphasize that Mercury is like what we would call like a common planet.
Mm-hmm.
So it can, because it's really versatile, um, it can kind of pick up the characteristics of things that it's near, as
Mm-hmm.
well as the sign that it's in. So for example, like I've been working more with temperament in my astrological practice recently, and Ali Lomi has like, you know, I've been kind of working with the lectures that he's put out about it, and it's like all the planets kind of have natures that can get uh, moved a little bit by the environment that they're in. So like Jupiter
Mm-hmm.
is hot and wet and Venus is cold and wet, but like that can change a little bit. But Mercury is really like, it really just picks up the temperament of the sign that it's in. So in a fire sign, it would be hot and dry. But in
Yeah.
a, in an earth sign, it would be cold and dry. And
Yeah.
so Mercury is the planet that really kind of like absorbs what's around in its environment. And so I just wanted to kind of emphasize that a little bit. It's a very changeable planet.
It
Uh,
is. Yeah. And that's why like and that's why because of that changing nature, I think that's why like I do feel like Mercury can also feel like it becomes like the bad guy too, because it's like always changing. Right. It's like,
mm-hmm,
oh, like what's your stand? I'm like, oh my God. It depends on who I'm talking to.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Because it is very much like that, right? It's like, what is the field? Like Mercury is, I think that's the thing with Mercury. I think it's always aware of the field that they are in. Um, and so it's like if you're going to different worlds, if you're going to different realms, you kind of got to pick up like the code, like whatever the people are there. And I think that's also like the versatility of like the moon, Mercury, sort of like the moon and Mercury kind of like shares that sort of like sense as well. Like, but then I think Mercury is the one that like really changes its forms. It's like
mm,
it would really change itself. Which is kind of funny because yesterday night I was just laughing so hard with one of my friends because I think our food delivery came, and then I think the food delivery couldn't access the building, and he was calling me, the food delivery guy, and I answered the phone, and I really like almost put on a different persona. Um, and then my friend was like, "What was that?" And I was like, "What?" And then he was like, "Oh my God, yeah." I like he was like, "You always do that." And I'm like, "Yeah." Um, I mean he was kind of high, and that's why he was like very discerning of my movements, I guess. So
mm,
and then we spend time talking about how actually I actually as a person I do behave like kind of differently whenever it comes to different settings. Yeah.
mm. Yeah. And I just want to like kind of take, because I think Gemini can get some hate because of that, because people are
Yeah.
like, oh, Gemini can be two-faced or Gemini can be changeable, like too changeable. But I just
Mm-hmm.
want to kind of try to take the morality out of that and see and like look at that as like a bit of a survival, not like a survival mechanism, but kind of like there
Mm-hmm.
is real, it's like part of why Mercury can do so well under the beams of the sun, for example. Like most planets
Mm-hmm.
under the beams of the sun get burned up, and like really it's bad for them. But Mercury is like, I'm cool. Like I can
Yeah.
adapt, and that
Yeah.
adaptability I think can be a real asset. And of course there are limits to that, just like there's limits to anything else. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like there's a contextual element to it. But yeah, I just want to emphasize that like being able to adapt is a real gift and it's a real skill.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is definitely adaptable and versatile. Like I love having that sort of like whenever I meet another Gemini energy, I can tell that like they are being super adaptable.
You could see it.
Yeah, I could see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you can just suggest something and then, Gemini would be like, yeah, I'm down for that. Like, they'll be like, they'll be fine with it.
Hmm.
Which is very airy, right? It's just like air has this sort of quality of like, the current of like, and yeah, all air signs has this sense of like non-attachment in some ways. And then like, yeah, and then Gemini is kind of like one of those bees that just goes around and like all the like, or even like the social butterfly is always equated to like a Gemini or a Gemini moon sort of energy too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah. Do you we've talked a little bit about your moon in Gemini already, and
Mm-hmm.
we've talked a little bit about your moon in the seventh house in Gemini, but do you want to share more about that context and how that shows up in your experience of that planet?
Yeah, a lot of people people have been I've been reading a lot about like the lunar mansion of like Gemini as well, and I know
Mm,
there's like Alhana there for my moon. Um, and then it's always about like union and kind of just like feeling very like camaraderie almost, right? Um, and then I do think sometimes people equate like Gemini, and then someone pointed out about because I used to tell the story about my brother a lot through the lens of my Aquarius Saturn, because I have Aquarius Saturn in the third house. Um, and I have a brother who has autistic and has like kind of like severe autism in a lot of ways.
mm,
And but then someone else um pointed out to me how the myth of like Castor and Pollux was kind of like living out in my life in that way. And I kind of wonder, I've
mm,
seen this played out in some people's life, but I think the role of the Castor Pollux can change. It doesn't mean that it's siblings, right? Because not everyone has siblings, one. Not
right.
everyone is, but then somehow there's always this kind of like story of like having like having to sacrifice one part of self for the sake of the
Mm,
others. And I think that's actually very Gemini Moon, to be honest. And it kind of it makes a lot of sense. Because it was kind of like live out that story of like, oh my God, like your brother, quote unquote, because actually Castor and Pollux are not like they're not twin brothers. They're actually from different mothers, etc. They're only
mm. Can you give us like a brief summary of the myth? Because
oh
I actually am not that familiar with it.
Oh, okay. All right. So Castor and Pollux, I'm like, literally googling right now. I remember one of them are they're half brothers, twin half brothers.
Okay.
Um, and so their parents are Leda, and one of them is Zeus. I think it's
Mm,
um, if I'm not mistaken, Castor was the one who was murdered. Um, and then Pollux was the one is half god, right? Because Castor is actually non a half god, is like basically mortal. And so because Pollux was like grieving and like begging, sad because of like the twin quote unquote twin brother's death,
mm,
he kind of and then Zeus kind of like elevated them to become forever brothers in the skies and this constellation. And
mm.
so that's kind of like the dynamic of like Castor and Pollux, basically.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, and so there's always a story of like they're called like Dioscuri, like I mean the two like I mean the myth together, the twin half
Hmm.
brothers. And so yeah, Pollux is the divine son of Zeus, um and Castor was the mortal son of Tyndareus, something like that, the king of Sparta. And so that was a kind of like story of like kind of like a sacrifice for brotherly love in some ways,
Mm,
right? But it's kind of I've seen it in a lot of like other Gemini moons where they kind of have to kind of like sacrifice something in their life, or they feel that they're obligated something to their quote unquote siblings, or maybe they're also,
mm,
or maybe it could also be a friend or something. Sometimes I realize it shows up as friends, or it shows up as a member um they grew up with or something like that. And so yeah, for me, like that story feels very like that myth feels very alive, because almost when I was growing up that I really feel the energy that was, I almost feel like, oh, like I need to take care of my brother, right?
oh, wow.
And so, which kind of makes sense too, because it's like we're dealing with this sort of like, um, you like, because that there's this duality that exists, and so you feel that you have to make a choice or something like that, right? You're like, you have to
Right.
like sacrifice something and then you have to take the other. And so it kind of plays out really well with like the Decan story of the Gemini as well. It's like the Eight of Swords, right? It's like, and then there's the Nine of Swords, and then the Ten of Swords. It's like, yeah, I mean, Ten of Swords is like kind of like the ultimate death. And like, that's like, okay, you have to choose something.
Mm,
Um, and so I do feel that sort of energy or that sort of storytelling seems to be very much alive for some Gemini moons. And yeah,
yeah.
I wonder. Mm-hmm,
Can you talk us through the correspondences a little bit? Because I'm
mm-hmm,
familiar with the Ten of Swords. I do a little bit
mm-hmm.
of tarot with like the Rider Waite Smith deck.
Yeah.
Interested what deck you use, but can you tell us a little bit about the imagery of the 8, 9, and 10 of Swords and
Yes.
how that
Yeah.
relates?
yeah, I mean, the Eight of Swords is someone who's like full of doubt and then kind of just like trying to untrap themselves from like the shackling of like from their back, right? So it's like there's all these
Mm,
doubts, and usually Eight of Swords signifies some sort of like moments where we have extreme doubts, um or we are not like sure of oneself. It's just because we don't feel complete in some way. And I think
okay.
that can represent that sense of like separation in Gemini, right? And Gemini, even in the body, kind of like represent that.
Mm,
And then the Nine of Swords is when the nightmare happens, and when actually like when it feels very real. Like so Nine of Swords is
mm,
like the figure just wakes up from the nightmare. So usually it's like a figure waking up from nightmare, and then there's like all these nine swords at the background. And usually it's like it's almost they just had a very bad dream and
right.
something like that. And that usually is a card of like depression. And I mean the swords in the tarot are always not being portrayed quote unquote the best, which actually that's
Mm,
actually something I have problems with, but that's a different
interesting.
discussion. And then the Ten of Swords is when like you see someone basically like laying down on the floor and like on like the ground, and they're basically being killed, like impaled by all
Right.
these different swords.
Mm,
And so it kind of like had the story of death in a lot of ways. So yeah, and so usually people equate that as almost like a decision or something that was beyond your power in some ways as well, that needs to happen, um, regardless of like all the various options that you have. Yeah.
very interesting. So, one follow-up question I want to ask about the eight and nine of swords. If I remember correctly, the eight is the person blindfolded and there's like eight swords
Mm-hmm.
around them. They
Yeah.
also have their hands tied behind their back.
Yes.
So it's my kind of like if I'm remembering eight and nine correctly, nine, there's like a under the bed, there's like a sword, correct?
One of it, yeah. And then there's also
Yeah.
sword laying at the like almost like hanging. Yeah.
Mm. And I feel like with those cards in particular, there's like I always thought with the eight of swords, like the person could just kind of like lean over and cut their bounds. Like they could kind
Mm-hmm.
of cut themselves free if they just
Yeah.
like moved a little bit. And
Yeah.
with the nine, there's like the option to kind of like reach for that tool that's accessible. And so there's
Yeah.
this idea of like there's this other whether you think about like other way of thinking with the swords and kind of like
Mm-hmm.
mental energy, or there's another idea.
Mm-hmm.
um I wonder if that plays in at all or if resonates anything for
No,
you.
I think that's very true because it's always like trying to make a decision between like, yeah, it's like, oh my God, like your life or the other person's life. It's kind of like that, right? Almost like almost giving you like a hard choices in a lot of ways.
Mm,
And I see like Nine of Swords is kind of like thinking about the hard choices in life. And it's like I think Nine of Swords is like that part where the illusions becomes real, like when the
mm,
nightmare becomes very loud and it almost like penetrates everything that you're like, okay, this is actually like this reality is almost like I think that's what's like the power of Gemini energy is kind of like it has this ability to see through an option and kind of like even manifest it to become real, like kind of like be very intimate with like every single of the different options that's available. Almost it already happened in some ways as well.
mm.
And I think
Wow.
that's how I think that's how I conceptualize the image of the Nine of Swords, which sometimes people always equate them to like extreme sense of fear as well. Like I mean, yeah, Nine of Swords is not like the best card when you
Right.
pull it, but I always try to understand the decan less through the imagery of the tarot itself. It's more about like, okay, what is this? What is it telling about like the Gemini energy in itself? And yeah, because it can also just represent like when you have too much information, then you can't choose, or like you're being like pacified
Mm,
in a lot of ways, right? Like analysis paralysis kind of thing, um, and then you can't make a choice. Yeah.
mm. Very interesting. Wonderful. And one other thing I just want to ask really quickly
Mm-hmm.
to clarify is just briefly, can you tell us about like what the lunar mansions are and
Oh,
how you use lunar mansions in your practice if that's a thing you use a lot?
yeah, I mean, I always try to look at them, and I mean, Lunar Mansion, I use the Arabic Lunar Mansions. There are 28 mansions.
Mm-hmm.
They always start at the I use tropical degrees, so they always start at the degrees. Regardless, they always start at cardinal sign. So if you realize like all the lunar mansions are kind of like it always starts at zero Aries, zero Cancer, zero Libra, and zero Capricorn. And the two mansions are majorly in Gemini. There's one mansion which are crossover between Taurus and also Gemini. Um, just a little part of it, but like I think from 3 degree, we have Alhana, which is one mansion of Gemini, which is related to like unions and bonds, which is
Mm,
kind of like okay, it kind of like talks about this sense of like union. It kind of like reminds me of like the card of like the lovers card in a lot of
right.
ways. Um, and then the later part is Aldira, which usually is good for everything. It is like for
Mm,
commerce, which is also something we don't talk about. Mercury. Mercury is also it's the god of like or the god of the trades, right? The merchants, right?
right.
And so there is something very like manifestation based with regards to this. Like one is more about relationships and the other one is more about like business and like trades and stuff like that.
Mm,
Yeah, and sometimes people use Luna mentions more so for astrological magic and creating lunar talismans, etc. But they actually hold like nativity sort of like storytelling as well.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
mhm.
Yeah, I'm reminded of there's a lecture that Ali Alomi has about the nature of the soul. And one of the things he talks about is to look at the natal lunar mansion for
Yeah,
saying something about the soul of the native and kind of like things that they might need to um, the lunar mansion can say perhaps issues that could come up, and as well as
yes,
prescriptions that can be prescribed to kind of like
yeah,
aid the native to have like a temperamental balance or what have you.
yes. Yeah, no, I love looking at the mansions and kind of just like trying like I think it's more esoteric in some ways as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it's also like for me, I think if you're looking at the moon, I think you kind of like have to look at the lunar mansions. Like you can ignore other placements with regards to the lunar mansion, but it's like it's got like Manzil al Qamar, which is literally the mansions on the moon, and it's like it's kind of like specified to the moon for a reason in some ways as well. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and just for anybody that's curious, I'm not an expert on the history, but I think that um, the lunar mansions or the manzils starts in India, where they
Hmm.
had a proceeding before like how do
Which
I
is like
describe this?
the nakshatras, right?
Yeah, they have this idea of the nakshatras, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
lunar zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, which are based on constellations and stars rather than yeah. So it's just kind of um, this idea that gets moved between India and different centers where astrology is taking place and kind of gets used in different ways and similar ways. And so just wanted to comment on that just a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Yeah, because technically, if it's by the Vedic system, I have a Rohini Nakshatra moon, which is also like apparently very good. So it's like
Mm,
it's kind of interesting, like to have this sort of like, oh, but Gemini doesn't have any dignity in terms of like blah blah blah, right? In terms of moon dignity, but then Rohini, like Rohini is kind of like in. I mean, I mean, it's a tropical sidereal thing as well, but like it yeah, for me that is like that's why I actually that's also very Gemini moon of me. Like I actually go and learn Vedic just for fun and I'm not an expert at it. And I think
hmm
that's also like really is what Gemini energy is like. I don't need to know if there is an information available. I need to know even that's a sprinkle of it. Right. I need to know that there's like even the slightest sprinkle of information about myself that
hmm
would perhaps help me in my growth. Like I'll take
hmm
it.
Yeah. And I think being able to reconcile the dualities, because I think many
Uh-huh.
people fight over tropical and sidereal, thinking that they're
Yeah.
opposed. Where, I would just want to point people back to my episode with Astrologon, where we talked about,
Astrologon, yeah.
yeah, his like, or their bizodiacal perspective, where they both are a
Mm-hmm.
student of Jyotish and also are a student of Hellenistic and use both in kind of a complementary way. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely a way to reconcile the different information that's coming from
Yeah.
both of these systems.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love it.
Yeah.
I got like a Vedic Jyotish reading recently, and I was like, oh wow, like I never knew that, and that's very illuminating and helping me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, me as well. Yeah, like there's at least I've worked with John. I've also done a reading with Freedom Cole, who is John's teacher and is,
Mm,
kind of many people's teachers in the community, and was prescribed like a mantra practice, which I've been doing, which has been really helpful. So I definitely
mm,
encourage people to do it. And John has availability and very affordable rates. And um, Freedom, when I went to Freedom, I was like, hey, John gave me this different, because I'm born on the sidereal cusp of Sag rising and Scorpio rising. And I was
yeah.
like, John moved my birth time a few minutes ahead so that I'm Sag rising, because he thought that that fit my personality, whatnot, a little bit more. And Freedom was like, yep, John called it. John did a good job. So yeah, I would definitely suggest people reach out to John for
Wow, that
those
is
readings.
interesting. I love that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk about the relationship of your moon and your sun and the
Mm-hmm.
role that lunar phase plays in your experience of your moon. And I think this is really interesting. I'm trying to remember if there are other people that I've had on that have this phase. I think there might have been a few, but
A
curious to hear your
crescent phase. Oh,
curious
yeah.
to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think I always view a crescent phase as more about like emerging from the darkness in a lot of ways. And like it's when the moon only reflects, okay, so I think I'm so privileged in some ways because I have this weird lunar solar partile situation. It's literally on the same degree. I think it's
Mm,
by 20 minutes or so. But the moon is basically approaching the sun. And so it's like one of those elections things. They're like, all right, this is such a sweet moon. Um,
mm,
and I feel that for people with crescent moon, what always comes up for me, even in my readings, whenever I see a crescent moon signature, um, there's always something that they are trying to emerge from the story of the sun. So wherever the sun is placed, and so for me, it's like the fifth house. Creativity is not something I always felt creative, but I never felt like I always feel like I have to struggle with it in the sense of like there is a lot of like asking myself the question of whether like what is actually emerging within me, because you have to understand that like it crescent moon comes from a dark moon, so it is it comes from like the sense of like not having light at first, right? And
mm,
then there's a sliver of light, and so what do you do as a sliver of light? It's not to say it's not resourceful, whatever. There's still a lot of darker parts of the moon, parts that are not being illuminated yet. And so there is this sense of like working with something quite internal in a way of like trying
mm,
to emerge of like, all right, how do I collect more light, right? Because the idea of the moon is always about like, collecting light and disseminating light, like collecting light and
right.
disseminating light. And so whenever someone has a crescent, it gives like that sense of taste. For me, it gives that sliver of taste, and you are and and from that taste you have to emerge, like you have to kind of like trust it as well. So it is, and that's the good thing about having a darker part of the moon, because I think what I'm realizing more and more, because sometimes people with like that the shadow part of the moon, right? It's actually the unknown in some ways, but it can
Mm,
also be represented by intuition, right? It can also be represented
right.
by things which are yet to be revealed, yet you are curious about it.
Mm,
And so I always feel that sense of emergence with people with crescent moon. And then usually what I do in the reading is always like, all right, so let's look at the sun and position and the moon position and those houses and kind of just like, okay, what are they both trying to emerge together, right? And it
mm,
comes from the sun, but like the moon is the one doing sort of like the work of trying to manifest that quote unquote desire
yeah.
um in a lot of ways. And so I do feel that a lot with my creativity. Like for example, I mean, I've always grew up with a sense of like, oh yeah, I am kind of creative, but like I've always been very academic because of that Gemini a lot of air sign in my chart, like Grand Trine sort of signature. But then I think my fifth house took a bit of a while to really recognize. Like I started dancing at a very later age in life. I was like on
Mm,
my 20s. Um, I never found like even if I'm obsessed with something, like I feel like it was always like for me the topics of fifth house that I was trying to struggle and find. I always feel that I am the one having to like, all right, I feel there's something here. And so I need to
mm,
like always answer the calling. And I think Crescent Moon always kind of have to do that, right? Because it it is still emerging. And so it has to play around and it has to kind of like experiment a bit. Because yeah, because that's how you and fail also. I think like Crescent Moon also has that like quality is almost like a beginner kind of like like there's always that sort of like beginner energy that
mm-hmm.
exists in a crescent moon, I feel. And so it gives room for experiments for people with that sort of signature because the first square would be where the crisis happens. So I think in a way crescent moon is nice because it's like, all right, you're like people kind of give you some slack or people give you chances in some way, but then you are the one are being asked to actually initiate whatever you desire with regards to that sun and moon sort of like storytelling.
That's a beautiful description. Thank you for that. Wonderful. One question I have is, so I'm just reminded of my own natal moon, and we have kind of like opposite moons. I think yours has like waxed a little bit more.
Oh,
So you're like 60 degree, almost exactly 60 degrees away from your sun, right?
yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
exactly 30 degrees away, but waning. So I have like,
Okay.
because that word intuition really jumped out to me because I think I've heard the balsamic moon described as kind of like a very intuitive moon.
Uh-huh.
But it's like moving towards the sun, so moving towards that completion. So it's like
Uh-huh.
not quite a mirror image because you're 60 degrees out and I'm 30 degrees
Mm-hmm.
to like the conjunction with the sun. But that's just interesting how, I mean, the moon is very intuitive anyway, but like how
Mm-hmm.
that darkness, different phases of the darkness and light can kind of
Mm-hmm.
mirror each other and play in differently.
Yeah, no, I actually love that part so much. And yeah, because it's kind of like, yeah, for me, the I love the darker part of the moon, and that's always something I wonder. Um, I do I always see it as like but with like the waning side. I mean, there's always that sense of like knowing already. I mean, obviously everyone has that sense of intuition knowing, but
Mm,
that's already like inherent in some ways and they like there is a sense of there's something wanting to complete something, right? It's like
mm,
I want to finish the story or something like that from that point of knowing. But then I think people with like on the waxing side, there's always this feeling that there is this unknown that they actually want to know kind of feeling. And so
yeah.
it is a very different relationship to the darkness of the moon in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's that same internality that you talked about of like seeing inside that there are seeds sprouting and
Mm-hmm.
wanting to potentiate that, wanting to kind
Yeah.
of initiate that in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than like being at the end of the cycle and seeing what the whole process has been already and how that can be brought to completion. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
different kind of energy.
It is, it is. And I think it's like it is kind of like how you inspire like it is how kind of like you inspire other people to like it's kind of like the moon's work for me. It's like the moon's job can be about that, right? Because sometimes sometimes it's hard to like talk to people about like those kind of like intuition stuff if they don't get it. And then
Mm,
but yeah, I always see it as like, okay, yeah, so your moon really has this sort of like serving potential of like, for example, like a square moon would be very great in terms of like that project, right? When you have a project and you're at a point of crisis, I think people with a square moon would probably be the best person to kind of like solve it, you know?
mm,
And then people with a full moon, they probably be good at, like once it kind of like reach its like, the maximum already like publishing or whatever, and they would be very great at that. And so it's like, and so for me, and I mean, if we, in terms of transit wise, I always just use, I use the progress moon transit as well to kind of like
mm-hmm.
see the phases of life and
Yeah.
how does that cycle goes around. Yeah.
Yes, Steph touched on that in a recent episode, and I've also been using that in like the timing consults I've been doing. I don't look a ton at the secondary progress chart, but I will like take note of the secondary progressed lunar cycle in particular, because I do
Mm,
think it is so um it can be so descriptive of like the chapter of life that the person is in. I've seen that in
yeah,
my own personal life for sure.
yeah,
Where are
no.
you at in your progressed lunar cycle?
I'm actually the same as a crescent because my progress sun is actually Taurus and my
Oh, okay.
progress moon is Cancer.
Oh, cool. That's
Yeah,
awesome. So we are at the same phase because
yeah.
I just had my progressed new moon a year ago exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I'm just about to move into like the first like little sliver is about to become
Oh,
visible.
nice,
Yeah,
nice.
I'm
Yeah. Oh my God, I
excited.
love that. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, my progress is, yeah, it's emerging. Yeah.
What seeds do you see sprouting in your life? Because I
I
feel like
think,
that's like
yeah,
the
honestly, I think spirituality really came to me
mm,
during my dark moon, lunar. Yeah, like, yeah, I think it really was during that phase was when I kind of like really discovered spirituality and putting in whatever, like, yeah, I think I had my Gemini moon, Taurus of Gemini moon with like going to school, which is very literal, right? It's like,
mm,
Taurus, and then I had my Gemini moon, and I went back to become a student. And so now I'm like, okay, and then I'm a Cancer moon now, and I'm back home. So it's kind of
mm,
wild how it has become kind of like very literal. I mean, I had Cancer moon since last year, so technically I was already a Cancer moon when I was in New York. But then this year I think it's like it becomes a later degree, right? Because it moves by 13 degrees or something. Um, so yeah, so that has like, and so for me, it feels like whatever my suprasensory Shahir is kind of like the next emerging story, basically.
amazing, very
You
exciting.
know,
Yeah, and is your progressed descendant still in Sag, or have you moved into
no, I'm
Capricorn?
Capricorn. I think
Okay,
sometime last year, it moved in Capricorn. Yeah, because I have
okay,
very early
cool.
degree Sag rising. And so it really just progressed last year.
Mm,
Yeah.
very cool. Okay. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about your Mercury and
Mm-hmm.
where it's placed in your chart and the sign it's in and how that kind of like adds a flavor to your moon.
Yeah, of course. I love Mercury. Although, like, when I first learned astrology, I was so demotivated though, because I was like, I did not know. Like, I was like, oh no, Mercury in Pisces. So I have Mercury in Pisces, which is a fallen Mercury, quote unquote, right? It is fallen, um, meaning that Mercury is a bit under resourced allegedly in Pisces just because Virgo is the exaltation and the domicile of Mercury. And so just by design, Mercury in Pisces is fallen. But then I remember coming back to whatever you said just now too, of how amongst all the planets, right? Because Mercury is kind of adaptable even though it's a fallen Mercury. That's why I love Dr. Olumi so much too, because it's like, yeah, even though it's a fallen Mercury, it's always trying to make do with whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, right? Um, and so for me, my Mercury is in Pisces in the fourth house, in the house of hidden. It's very angular, so it's like for me, I remember it's like for me, I am very connected with my Mercury in a lot of ways because for me, like when I learned esoteric, like everything just makes sense. Like I literally I think I literally sped up my learning in terms of like the divination and stuff. Everything just feels very natural for me to
Mm,
understand the language of the unseen. And so
wow.
that
Yeah.
really helps. I think that's why I think I love when Dr. Lumi said like, yeah, Mercury and Pisces, like they're like the friends of the jinn or whatever, right? They can talk to the unseen realm. And for me, like
Mm,
even when I first started tarot reading, when I wasn't even fully spiritual, quote unquote, I was already like getting all this like images and I'm getting like presents and I'm like, what the fuck is happening?
mm,
And so I do feel there's almost a natural psychic nature to water Mercury's in general.
mm,
Um, just because it's like what I really love about having a water Mercury at least, it's kind of like you are tuning into the vibes, like you're tuning into the things which are almost unspeakable, right?
Mm.
It is like, and then I think that's why Mercury kind of like struggles a bit in a water sign compared to like um an air. So we look at Mercury. Mercury has dignity in air sign and also an earth sign, which is,
Mm.
if we go back to like the principles of alchemy, air and earth are actually more external,
Mm.
um, rather than fire and water, which is usually more internal in some ways, right? And that's why people always equate fire to like the spirit and water to like the intuition, emotions, blah, 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 blah.
Mm.
And so I do feel like having Mercury fallen does speak to about like the sense of like sometimes I can't speak. I mean, I have that Mercury overcoming square to my moon, and sometimes I used to really struggle with like communicating my emotions in a lot of ways. I
Mm.
still struggle with it, to be honest. Um, it gets better over time, obviously. But I remember when I was younger, I was like almost people even say like water Mercuries are like quote unquote mute, right? It's like a mute Mercury, meaning that they don't really speak in some ways.
Mm.
And so
Because the water element are like all the water signs are mute signs,
yeah,
whatever that
they're just
means.
like they're not trying to like they're not really trying to like for me water is always just trying to flow. It's not trying to direct something, right?
Mm.
I mean obviously Cancer has that cardinal energy which could be slightly different, but then there's something about water that just it is trying to like it is trying to like, okay, let me just ruminate on this or like kind of like sit with it for a bit, and allow like, trying to just allow things to come in, especially with Pisces, right? It's very inclusive. And so for me, it's
Mm.
always just like, oh, there's a lot, like there's this thing, there's that thing. And so yeah, it's very mutable, but it's angular. So I think it really helps in terms of like my career as like, I mean, I love to write,
Mm.
and I have my Substack, Suprasensory Substack, which you should all read. I actually, and that's how I kind of like communicate my feelings too, because I think that's actually what mute means in a way too, right? Like Mercury is not just about the verbal communications. It is also about writing, communicating in other ways. And I think
Right.
water Mercuries are more attuned to like, I mean, for me, my Pisces Mercury, I feel more comfortable with writing about certain emotions
Mm.
through writing it out, right? I can never, um, I think I always tell even some of my potential partners or lovers, like, I don't think I can even verbalize whatever I am texting you, because I feel
Mm.
like because it can feel so deep and
Yeah.
all those feels. And so yeah, writing is a way to like say the
Mm.
things which are almost unspeakable in some ways. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, and that just reminds me of Mercury's description as the scribe, which is
Mm-hmm.
literally like writing down what someone else is saying or
Yeah.
writing down like what has been written elsewhere rather than I don't know if Mercury gets described as the herald or who gets described as the herald, but the herald is the one that like kind of speaks or announces
Mm-hmm.
um, the coming of something else. And those are two different roles potentially.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think I love that. Yeah, I really agree with like Mercury as the scribes and like yeah, it is kind of like doing this translation work in some ways as well. And that's also interesting, right? Because that's also like the reason why like I think part of the reason why I think Pisces Mercury is also like fallen in some ways is because um Mercury in Virgo can definitely get verbatim of whatever is being said. Right? It's like, all right,
Mm-hmm.
this person said this, and I think that's like a Mercury in Virgo power, or even Mercury in Gemini. I think they're very good at like being the copier almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like almost like and that's kind of like part of the quote unquote job. And I think the reason why Mercury suffers in Jupiter signs is not really because they can't do that job, but then because Jupiter is also the one trying to give that similar knowledge. So it's like I do feel people with Mercury in a Jovian sign, it's kind of hard for them to like take something word for word,
Right.
just because in that process there's already an interference of like, if you see a Jupiter as also like a wisdom, right? It's like they they're doing that job similarly as well. And so that's what I
Mm,
realized whenever I read things, I can never truly quote directly from it. I will definitely say that I quote from it, but I'm always already have a different idea. It's kind of like the idea that nobody reads the same book, right? And that's
mm,
true because when you are reading a book, you already have an idea that you're also creating. And I think
right.
because it's Jupiter kind of like explode that process even more when Mercury is just like, okay, you just have to take this detail and that's it.
Mm,
But then Jupiter will be like, no, but there's this, and they're like, it kind of like explodes that detail a bit or even exaggerates it a bit, you know?
yeah. Yeah, just to kind of speak on that for a second. So like Jupiter's signs and Mercury's signs are in either opposition or square to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
Mercury gets associated with like the little details. Like Mercury's like a
Mm-hmm.
little guy trying to do,
Yeah.
trying to work with like little tools and little details. And Jupiter is like this big dude who's like, like the, bigifies things and is more interested in the big picture than like
Yeah.
the fine little details. And so that's why it can be difficult for Jupiter to be in a sign of Mercury or for Mercury to be in a sign of
That's
Jupiter. I
much.
think
Mm-hmm.
because Jupiter is the greater benefic and because Mercury
Mm-hmm.
is so flexible, like it's not, those oppositions and squares are maybe not as difficult as some other. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think that like the thing that comes to mind is like there are multiple ways to truth with
Mm-hmm.
Jupiter. And with Mercury, it's like there's only one way to rewrite something with accuracy,
Yeah.
perhaps. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And
It
those are
is
kind
about
of
being
at
accurate.
odds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So in Pisces, it's like if you can, like there's being out in the ocean and like these big waves at
Mm-hmm.
different moving in different currents and what have you, like so intensely that you can't even really see where the water's going or coming from. It's like
Yeah.
Mercury can't speak that with accuracy and precision. It has to kind of like speak the bigger vibe or say things in
Yeah.
like a poetic way or use
Yeah.
that flow to communicate.
Yeah, I know. I think that is definitely it is a very artistic Mercury and I love that too. It's like I mean Pisces at the end of the day is the place where the benefics are beneficing or something, right? Like
Right.
Venus exaltation and Jupiter's home. And so yeah, and I do have Mercury in the bounds of Venus.
Mm,
And so that's also like another thing. So yeah, whatever you're saying about imagery, that feels very true. And um it's like, yeah, like for example, my Gemini would have like Gemini can also have that's almost like the thesaurus sort of like brain, right? Mercury kind of like, all right, what word can I use now? Like that is actually different, right? Because I don't want to sound the same. So I think Mercury also has that sort of like power, but then in Pisces, it can just feels like, oh, but then what if actually someone doesn't understand it? And then I think
mm,
that is where the Piscean sort of like cover that can makes it a problem because I've had problems before this whenever I was writing for academic, for example, like my professors will never get my writing. And I was like,
mm,
fuck this shit, right? In a lot of ways. So like I have huge struggles like in terms of writing certain papers just because I have so big of an idea. And that's has always been my consistent comment from undergrad up until my recent finished master's. It was
mm,
always that. And I kind of know and then obviously I was like, all right, I know this is like a pattern of it's kind of like an obvious manifestation of my Pisces Mercury being very loud and can't like but the good thing is that like it does give you strategic or like it really like for me is like whenever planets are in detriment or antithesis or fallen, you have to kind of like creatively express it in other ways, and there's almost like no other way rather than embracing it. Rather, like people say like it's like almost like queering the planet, right? Like
mm,
you really have to flip the script of like how that planet is serving you or helping you in your life because it's non-traditional.
right.
um yeah, yeah,
That's wonderful. Yeah. I love that idea of queering the planet.
yeah, yeah.
Are there any aspects to your moon that you think would be important to discuss? We've
I
spoken about the sun and the moon, but anything
think
else?
I am like my moon trines like also my Jupiter, and so it's also like very big, and that
Mm,
like and so that's why I feel that I recently have my paid Substack, but then I was like, oh no, but I don't really want to make that many. I do believe like I think that's a Jupiter behavior. I was like, oh no, but I want my writings to reach everyone. I do
mm,
feel that sense of like a Jovian of like wanting like everyone to feel included or everyone to feel blah blah blah. And so I do have a very strong like my moon is actually also in the bounds of Jupiter, so
mm,
um I think that's the next aspect of my moon, like except from the partha to the sun, the next aspect is actually trining the moon. So because my moon is my trining Jupiter, because my Jupiter is at 10 degrees ish. Um my moon is 7, so I do feel that trine is rather loud and it really
mm,
works. One thing quite clear for me was that a lot of my 11th house, quote unquote, friends, I can almost let them all be my one on one friends. So it's like I always have this sort of like privilege in some ways where even the people who are in my 11th house, I can like pull them into my 7th house and I can just be in a partnership with them and I'll be fine, right?
mm,
Like I've had a lot of close friends from each and everyone. I can literally say like all my bigger group of friends, I can have a very direct one-on-one relationship with them. And I wouldn't say that is true for them and the other people in the group, kind of thing.
mm-hmm.
And so I
Yeah,
think that's like the Mercury, I think that's the moon Jupiter really helping. Yeah, and for me, like Moon Jupiter for me too is like it's also like for me, for example, like the typical expression of the moon, which is like the mother, and Jupiter is the spiritual. So it's like, yeah, I do learn a lot of my spirituality through my maternal line.
mm.
Um, and so that was like because my mom is a Pisces rising, and I mean she's a Sag moon, by the way, she's a Sagittarius
Oh,
moon.
cool.
And so very Jovian. And we have similar notes. That's a key part as well. Like that's like very ancestral, like lunar notes, significator. And so I learned a lot of my spirituality through my mother.
Mm,
And so that's also part of it, like thing the moon, Jupiter sort of thing. Yeah.
that's beautiful. Have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your emotional life? And if so, what have you found?
Oh, I do feel that I always track my lunar return, which is kind of funny because it's gonna happen soon enough because we're recording at this time. Um, I always track my lunar return. I almost always have a tarot spread sometimes. To just that's kind of my moon reset, and so that's
Mm,
always true for me. I track. I go by. I forgot. Like I think it's also like the medieval Islamic stuff or certain transit. I feel like I do look. I feel I'm very affected by the moon in a lot of ways. The more I pay attention to it,
mm.
for example, like dream revelation happens when like the moon is in my ninth or the moon is in my
Oh,
third,
interesting.
um, or whenever um I also get like because I have a eighth, like I mean we both have this eighth house ruled by like Cancer, and then the moon is in the seventh. It it kind of like sometimes I dream about other people too. Like I
Mm,
almost will prophesize for other people, and sometimes it's scary. Um,
mm.
but then that's more for like warnings and stuff, usually.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so like it's kind of
Mm,
wild because it's almost like, oh yeah, like my moon is almost not, I mean, obviously it's in service to me, but then yeah, whenever I track the moon, sometimes it can be quite like, oh, like actually it's not about me. It's actually about like about this. Like, but yeah, it's almost like for me, it's almost always ritual. Like whenever the moon approaches my Jupiter, I'm always just like doing some things with my friends or something like that. And then when the moon is in my 12th house, I try not to go out unless those are the people that I really, really know, or like I'm uncovering something deeper. Yeah, it has been so loud to like because I also do like new like I think when I started being aware of what importance of my like I think when I first started I was a night sec. I literally was consciously um tracking my moon transit just because inherently I just felt very solar. But then
mm.
but then it makes sense, like, but then it also makes sense because I have that solar lunar. So like, I mean, my moon is also in the seventh, so it's like it has always been something that feels far away, right? It feels like, oh my God, this energy is actually disturbing me. Like I used to be very uncomfortable with my emotions in a lot of ways. Um,
Mm,
and but then over time, I'm like, okay, this is great. I love it.
that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah. The moon in the seventh and its associations with like being the opposite of the ascendant, being opposite
Yeah.
of like the native. That's really interesting to think about. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
interesting too what you said about like dreams. I think about the eighth as like it's other people's resources, but I think also it's like in what ways can we resource other people? So
Mm-hmm.
if I may, you have your Mars there, and
Yeah.
it feels like an interesting thing that your dreams, and dreams are often associated with both Cancer and the Moon,
Mm-hmm.
um, are like a defense Mars for other
Yeah.
people. So like you're
Yeah.
providing other people a resource through this like unusual martial manifestation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so true. Yeah. Like
Yeah.
for me, it's like whenever I dream of other people, it usually feels a bit like a bad omen, but it's usually also for like, it's also just like a reminder. Like I've had dreams of like certain friends, or sometimes I just like reach out to them, whatever. But yeah, it's almost always like, usually whenever I dream of other people, it's usually for crisis mode.
Mm,
And rather than for or like helping mode in a way too, like you're responding to a crisis in a way as well. But yeah,
mm,
it seems very Martian in that, like usually it is. Yeah,
yeah.
I have like crazy fights in my dreams. It's like I would never have those kind of fights in my real life.
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah.
So what suggestions would you have for someone who's new to astrology or planetary relationship in forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Ooh, I think, oh, I love that. Like the image that comes to my mind is actually like, because I'm a tarot reader too, right? Like really like the high priestess sort of imagery, right? Which is
Mm,
someone standing at this sort of like temple or whatever you call it, like between these two pillars of intuition. I do feel that to be in relationship to your moon is really to be in relationship with your own personal rhythm and your personal cycle. Um, and it's hard because I think a lot of like our culture kind of like don't want us to listen to our bodies in a lot of ways, right?
mm,
Um,
yes.
and I think it's very important when to work with the moon is to listen to your body. Um, and so whatever that means, so you like, and because for me, like I used to have problems with my when like, self-perception of the body even. And so for me, it's
Mm,
more like a spiritual body or like whatever, like physical, mental body, etc. Um, and I think acting from that, right? Acting from that sense of like like yourself best, obviously, but also like cultivating that voice is actually very important to work with the moon, because it's like, yeah, it's like the moon is always trying to like tell you something. It's like
mm,
it's always moving, it's cardinal in its nature. Is always trying to reflect something within you. And so yeah, like I would really recommend doing any sort of practices that makes you more attuned to your body, whether it
mm,
be like even like having a massage, or like it require, for me it does require like ask like the time alone to be with like what, even like having the entire interrogation with yourself of like what is listening to the body means to you, right? Because sometimes people say it so much, but then you don't know like what it means actually, like for you
mm,
personally, of like what really works.
mm,
And so I think that would be part of it, of what
mm.
listening to your body is like really finding that voice yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, you're reminding me of like the wisdom of like the void, the wisdom of the moon
Mm-hmm.
being void, and it's like the moon likes to connect, but it's like if you're just connecting and then transferring light and you're not taking the time to like be in the void and be kind of not connecting, be by
Mm-hmm.
yourself, then you don't get the benefit of that kind of reflection and like what it all kind of means to be to be the moon, to be embodied, to be moving through the world and bringing these different things together. And yeah, I'm just, thinking about that.
Yeah. And what I was realizing too was like, because I was traveling from New York to here, um, and then I think that is like sometimes, and that is why like that gives me a different illumination of how the moon is connected to like travelers, because obviously the
Mm,
moon is moving, it's from people from different culture, blah blah blah. But like, yeah, whenever the moon is void, like whenever you're in transit, it kind of is like it kind of like you're alone, right? Like, I mean, if you're not traveling with like a bigger packs or whatever, because I was traveling alone. If you're just on your own and you're traveling, for example, if you go on a solo travel, it kind of feels like you are doing a lunar sort of work. Although,
mm,
like, although I know Sag is like Jupiter is always related to traveling, but um, it is talking about like the moon is like constantly in transit. And so it kind of like reminds me of like, okay, when you're traveling, you kind of do according to like whatever you feel like. You do have this sort of like, all right, I'm on my own, and like and then what do I do? And I think that's like very lunar sort of work. Like, okay, what is actually emerging within me rather than reacting to external expectations or external stimuli, right?
mm,
Um, and so like asking what's actually the stimuli and the stimulus like within you. Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I think the moon void is also like a great example of how you can be in that sort of like meditative space, right? With the moon. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's travel and solo travel. It's definitely very evocative of me and some good memories, like getting in touch with myself. So I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe because I am also like a Gemini, because I mean Gemini and Sag is also like the travel sort of like access. So maybe that's why I'm
Right,
also saying that out.
right. All right. Is there anything you want to add? Do you have any imparting thoughts about the moon?
No, I think I am like wholesome with this, and I even like see I have like really Moon K2 situation going on, because it means being activated as a perfected house and sign, because I literally was just like, okay, what did I say a few days ago? It's like, and so I'm just gonna like find out later.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I think we covered a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, had a great like Sag Gemini dynamic of bouncing off different ideas and getting into the details and relating that to the big picture. So I really appreciate it.
Oh my
Um
God. Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. All right, where can we find you, and is there anything you're working on that you'd like to let us know about?
Oh, okay. Where to find me? I am mainly on Suprasensory Shahir. I have my booking links there. I can send you all the details.
Yeah.
I've been in the mode of like writing a lot lately, so yeah, people can find me on my Substack. I tweet sometime. I mean, I tweet my monologue all the times actually. Whatever I have in my brain, but right now I've been showing up a lot in terms of my tarot and astrology. Like I have birthday readings every this year I started like a different birthday readings that combines tarot that is astrology based, but I incorporate like oracle messages and tarot messages from the important planets that activated that year. So I think that's pretty unique. And then I've been showing up a lot to my tarot and astrology practice, just because I've been really loving you doing like using both systems for my client work, and
Mm,
it seems very enriching. However, if you just want one thing, you can also have like, I have tarot only, I have astrology only, and I also do spirit guide work. I've been putting on the back for a bit, but it's still there. I usually go through phases with it. Like it's actually like I
mm,
always, whenever I want clients for it, it will come. And so if you're interested to connect with your spirit guides, and honestly, I think that session is where my Mercury in Pisces really thrives, because
mm,
it's like you're giving me an open field, let me just do things. And I'm like, I love that session so much. And it's usually very, very magical. So it's like if you want an
mm.
enchanting, almost like ethereal time, I would recommend the Spirit House session. So yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I'll be sure to link all that stuff in the show notes so people have access to it. And again, Shahir, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And yeah, I'll see you at the next Ascendant Assemblies.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.